Good evening, everyone. My name is Emily Schrynemakers, and I'm going to be speaking to you about my final paper topic, which is focusing on performance-based funding and exploring its impact on underrepresented minority students. So to start off, let's establish what performance-based funding actually is. So performance-based funding, or PBF, is a public policy geared towards public institutions of higher education in the United States. It's a practice that makes a portion of state funding towards higher education contingent upon certain college performance indicators. What might these indicators be? So, for example, some funding models will utilize graduation rates. For example, we will give you a certain amount of money per year if you're able to graduate 30% of your student population. Another metric that's utilized under performance-based funding is focusing on student retention. So in higher education, that refers to retaining or keeping a student from one semester to the next. A major issue that plagues higher education is institutions accepting students but then not being able to keep them. So initial income numbers are great, but then after the first semester, there's a significant percentage of dropout. So this is one of the measures utilized by PBF. And another metric utilized in performance-based funding models, some of them, is a job placement as well. For example, an institution can say, we want to see how many of your bachelor's degree, the students who obtained a bachelor's degree were able to get a job paying more than $25,000 per year after graduating. So just to reiterate, performance-based funding is entirely based on student outcomes. It's tying funding to student outcomes. So why does this exist? Trends in public higher education policymaking point to an increased demand for institutional accountability and transparency, which is a theme that we've discussed throughout the course of the semester. Another reason is the skyrocketing cost of attending college, coupled with state budgetary constraints, have led policymakers, voters, and students alike to press colleges for more transparency and to take concrete action to improve student completion rates, student retention, and workforce preparedness. The ultimate goal is to improve student outcomes and increase graduation rates. So this map is not the most recent, but it's an example as of 2015 of the reach of performance-based funding. So this is not a niche practice, this is something that is sweeping the entire nation. So you can see the orange color indicates that performance-based funding is utilized at two-year institutions. The darker green indicates that it's in place at four-year colleges. The aqua color indicates both, which you see is the majority, both two-year and four-year institutions. And the yellow indicates, as of the time that this map was made, that there are a couple of states that are in transition that are working on implementing performance-based funding models. So now that we have a baseline established on what performance-based funding is, what are some of the metrics utilized, and what states just how widespread this is. These are some of the concerns that have come up in the research that I conducted on this topic. So as of 2018, nearly 35 states incorporate some form of performance-based funding in their funding models. However, despite its popularity, there is very little research that clearly demonstrates whether or not performance-based funding has an impact on traditional student success measures, such as retention and graduation rates. Growing research is showing that performance-based funding actually disproportionately impacts underrepresented minority student access to higher education. So since this is an area of personal interest and research in my higher education journey, I wanted to focus more on this issue and this concern that is emerging in the literature. So, just a little bit more about the existing research on the topic. One that I particularly like to cite because it was over the course of several years is Rutherford and Rabowski. They conducted a study over the course of 18 years that focused on the impacts of performance based funding on 568 four year institutions across 50 states. Their principal findings indicated that performance based funding is not linked to student outcomes, and that over time, the institutions in their study actually exhibited decreases in their graduation rates, which is the exact opposite of what we're looking for with this funding model, or the purpose of performance based funding. Other studies have also focused on the impact of performance based funding on four year colleges. Note that there's a real lack of studies on community colleges as well. Um, but yes, so this particular study, or I'm sorry, these two studies focused on four year colleges over the course of several years, and they came up with the same conclusion. Performance based funding was not linked to increased graduation rates. So we start to see, albeit a small sample of existing research, there is a trend being exhibited here. So, some of the key findings of my research on some of these unintended impacts of performance based funding, because as I delve deeper into the rabbit hole, I realized that the issue was not only that there's no clear research, but that this practice, I'm sorry, that there was no clear relationship between performance based funding and increased graduation rates, but there's also research showing that there are a lot of unintended impacts in this funding model on underrepresented minority and economically disadvantaged students. So, some of these findings include more selective admissions processes, which reduces underrepresented minority student access to higher education. Um, Changes in recruitment practices, where colleges will start targeting more gifted students, um, limiting the applicant pool and access for certain groups of students. And this is purely in the name of being able to meet the metrics for performance based funding. So you can start to see how this can be particularly damaging. Um, there's also the issue of lowered academic standards, which came up in some of my research. Some institutions, both community college and four year colleges, have been altering academic standards to make it easier for students to graduate and meet performance metrics. So, my research, I kind of did a survey of a couple of different states. I chose these states because they have different histories and models for their performance based funding. So, one example is Tennessee. It first incorporated this model in 1979, so it's the first state to actually utilize it. It's used at both 2 year and 4 year institutions, and it is an outcomes based model. So they look at graduation rates, job placement, credit accumulation. Those are just some examples of what institutions might use. In my research, I found that, in particular, community colleges in Tennessee have become more selective because of these funding models. So that was just one item takeaway. Another state is Ohio, introduced performance based funding a little bit later, in 1995. They utilize it at both 2 year and 4 year institutions, and it is also an outcomes based model. Differs for community colleges and 4 year institutions, so they have different scopes based on the type of institution. My research found that in Ohio, there were some 4 year colleges, university administrators shared that admission standards were raised in order to help meet performance based funding metrics. So they raised their standards to get a different type of student admitted to their institutions. And the last state I looked at was California, since their foray into performance based funding is a little bit more recent. It's called a student centered funding formula, so you can see they're utilizing semantics to sort of downplay the fact that this is also performance based funding. Approved in 2018, approved for community colleges. And their model uses a combination of funds tied to student enrollment, which is the traditional way of funding for public colleges, or at least, those in CUNY know that that's a big thing. There's also additional funds for students with financial necessity, which is good news for, if we're concerned about access for underrepresented minority or economically disadvantaged students. And there are also funds tied to degree completion metrics. So that's more along the lines of what we see performance based funding as. And I just put a note here that there are some concerns. There's research emerging and a lot of articles and topics where there are concerns expressed on how this will impact California's large minority student population, majority Latino students. So, some final considerations after doing this research. Obviously, more research needs to be conducted on the impact of performance based funding models on access to higher ed for minority students. The initial studies that I looked at, are of major concern to me as someone who's passionate about access to higher ed. Is this just completely counterintuitive? And there should also be a particular focus for studies for community college students, historically black colleges and universities, and minority serving institutions. And additionally, I believe that institutions should look to strengthen support systems for students admitted because of a need to meet performance based funding metrics. So, if you're going to admit these students, then to meet certain metrics and get your funding, then you also have to make sure that there are support systems in place to ensure that these students are retained and are successful. Thank you for listening to my presentation and have a great evening.